Good evening, everybody. My name is Martin Anthony. I'm head of the Mathematics Department here at the LSE. Thank you for coming to this public lecture organised by our department. A little bit of housekeeping. No fire alarm drill is tested, so its test is planned. So if it does go off, please evacuate the theatre following the stewards. Our speaker will talk this evening for around an hour, and then there'll be plenty of time afterwards for questions and answers. The lecture is being recorded, and it's hoped that a podcast of the event will be made available online soon. Please put your mobile phones on silent. Don't turn them off, because we hope that you'll be tweeting madly, and the hashtag is #LSE Maths. So I'm delighted this evening to welcome as our speaker Professor Barrow Green. June is Professor of History of Mathematics at the Open University, and also I'm delighted to say has recently become a visiting professor in our own department here at LSE, where she's been teaching a course to our undergraduates on the history of mathematics in economics and finance. June is an eminent historian of mathematics. Her work has focused largely on the late 19th and early 20th centuries, although she occasionally makes a foray back into earlier times. Among her particular interests is the history of women in mathematics. And we're very pleased that June was actually the inaugural speaker at our Women in Mathematics seminar that we started this year. June has published widely and notably was an editor of the Princeton Companion to Mathematics, a very impressive volume if ever you've seen it. June is a well-known leading figure in the mathematical community generally. She currently sits on the council of the London Mathematical Society, is a former president and currently sits on the council of the British Society for the History of Mathematics, and she is also Vice Chair of the International Commission on the History of Mathematics. June has been very much involved in public engagement and in raising the profile of mathematics, working on both television and radio, and she was recently heavily involved in the development of the Winton Gallery, the mathematics gallery that opened at the Science Museum last December. So who better to talk to us this evening than June Barrow Green? Please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you very much for that introduction. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you all for coming. I hope that I haven't got some of you here on false pretenses. Deliberately sort of ambiguous title, Mathematicians at War. If you've read the abstract, you'll know it's mathematicians and what mathematicians did during the First World War. It's not mathematicians pistols at dawn with each other. So anyway, my talk is going to be on what British mathematicians did basically during the First World War, how they contributed to the war effort and how the war affected them, both in their careers and how the war affected mathematics. So let me start, right, so just opening slide. So in January 1915, so George Greenhill, who was the professor, erstwhile Professor of Mathematics from the Royal Military Academy in Woolwich. He'd retired from there in 1908, but he was president of the Mathematical Association, institution still going today. It's the Association for Mathematics Teachers, and he gave a presidential address in which he entitled Mathematics in Artillery Science. And this address got very wide publicity. It was reproduced in full in the Times, in other newspapers, in Nature, and in the Mathematical Gazette, the journal of the Mathematical Association. And in this address, George Greenhill said, "It is a mathematical war." And this was a kind of quite a new way of thinking, or one might think a different way of thinking about the war. But what evidence did he have for that? Well, one of the things was that he had, before the war, he'd been to Germany, and he had been to see how the Germans were educating their soldiers, and he was very impressed with the amount of science that was being done, and in contrast to what the soldiers and the military in Britain were learning. And he discusses this in his talk, and he also gives sort of just some elementary examples of where mathematics can be used in war, just to kind of give the flavour of it. He said, well, you know, the theory of sound, if you understand the theory of sound, that will tell you how near you can afford to stand to a gun when it's being fired, so that you aren't deafened by it. Or, for example, you can use Euclidean geometry. If you have a fragment of a shell, you can use Euclidean geometry to work out what the actual caliber of that shell is. And he went on and gave other sort of examples. But was it really a mathematical war? Was he alone in thinking and putting it forward in that way? Well, there were one or two other people who were explicit in this way. Very, very soon after the outbreak of war, the American journalist Herbert Kaufman wrote an article in the Times where he said the range of weapons and modern tactics have set the struggle upon a basis of mathematics. And then later we get the reminiscences of a soldier, Private Gladden of the Northumberland Fusiliers, when he's describing the assault on Messines Ridge, and he just says, the poor devils caught in that terrible cataclysm had no chance. Yet what chance was there for anyone in that war of guns and mathematics? Even in a hospital, we see a nurse writing in 1915, a world apart, a world of insufferable space and agonizing time, ruled over by some inhuman mathematics. So what did all of these people mean by mathematics? Well, of course, we'll never know precisely. But I think we can think about perhaps with some of them, I mean, like the soldier, the numbers involved, I mean, the sheer scale of things, the action, you know, there's mathematics in that, in the organization. Probably Herbert Kaufman was thinking more about, he recognized that technology was going to be used in the war, and technology requires mathematics. Quite what the nurse meant, it's difficult to say. But what I hope to show you with some of these examples, that actually mathematics was played an important role in the war, and British mathematicians really contributed to helping win the First World War. Of course, one can argue about whether really anybody won the First World War, but that's not what I should be talking about. One of the really key things about the First World War, it's the first major conflict to be fought in the air. And I've put on this slide a few figures. These are kind of debatable. You see different figures in different places, but they're kind of, I think, they give a pretty reasonable idea of how area power grew and developed in the war. We start off 130 military aircraft in service. By 1918, 22,000 military aircraft in service. They can fly much faster, they can fly much higher. At the beginning of the war, people thought that you would only ever use a plane for reconnaissance. That was what they thought planes would be used for. Of course, they quickly realized that they could be used for more than that, and by the end of the war, of course, they were being used for bombing raids and shooting and so on. It is really such a really key factor in the war, this growth of aerial power. And mathematicians were involved in this in two ways, actually. They were involved in getting these planes up in the air, and they were also involved in shooting them down. Not the same ones, hopefully, but so they were involved in the sort of development of aerodynamics, and then they're also involved in anti-aircraft gunnery. And these are two areas which I will expand on. So starting with the development of aeronautics and so on, one of the centres where mathematicians show up is at the Royal Aircraft Factory in Farnborough. This institution, it started off as the Royal Balloon Factory, in Aldershot, moved to Farnborough in 1905, got renamed the Royal Aircraft Factory, and then at the end of the war it was renamed the Royal Aircraft Establishment, because in fact factory was really a bit of a misnomer, because it was never meant to be somewhere for churning out lots and lots of aeroplanes. It was somewhere where the development of planes, where the experiments were going on, where they were trying to improve planes to make them fly higher, longer, and so on. And they did build planes there, but actually it was largely the place where the development went on. And so this picture here is a picture of the factory in the war. It's a bit difficult to see, but just down in that far corner there, those of you near the front might be able to see just a couple of small planes on the ground down there. So who was there? Well, this is just a bunch of people who were either trained as scientists or mathematicians. I won't have captured them all here. E.T. Busk, who went to the aircraft factory in 1912, he was a Cambridge graduate. He had done very well in the mathematical tripos, and was by all accounts extremely talented mathematician. And he was responsible for designing, one of the people who helped to design one of the first really stable aeroplanes, the BE-2C, BE standing for Blériot Experimental. But Busk was killed in an accident in 1914, just after the outbreak of the war. And that had really quite an effect on what happened at the factory from the point of view of the scientists and the mathematicians getting into the air, because it was realized that it was safer to keep them on the ground if you wanted the development to progress. And in fact, in the war, huge numbers of planes were lost in accidents. And all the people here who's, you can see Keith Lucas, who died in 1916, David Pinson, who died in 1918, as well as they died in accidents. They didn't die in conflict. And I'm going to say a bit about one or two of these people. But it was a real tension, because the mathematicians started to get frustrated with the fact that they were having to rely on the pilots bringing them the data back. So the planes were going into the air and they were wanting to get the data from the pilots. And because the pilots didn't know what the data was being used for, and that pilots also, very much was the case that people tended to think, you flew on instinct. Why did you need the mathematicians? There was a sort of tension there. So the mathematicians wanted to get into the air, despite the danger. And of course they were young. They were, flight, it was very exciting. So it wasn't really until 1915 that they actually got back into the air again. They were able to persuade the powers that be that they needed to fly. And here we have a picture of some of them. I've circled the ones who are the real sort of mathematicians in the picture here. So on the left wall, we've got Herman Glauert, and he was one of the ones who actually definitely didn't want to fly. He kept his feet very firmly on the ground. He always said he didn't want to fly. G.P. Thomson, his father was J.J. Thomson, who'd won a Nobel Prize for the discovery of the electron. Frederick Lindemann, some of you may be familiar with him. He was later on in World War II. He was a scientific advisor to the government. He was a great friend of Churchill's, and he became Lord Cherwell. Extremely bright, extremely bright. G.P. Thomson, I should have said, he later, after the war, I think in 1937, goes on and wins a Nobel Prize himself. On the lower step there, David Pinson, I'm going to say something about him. And up there, Farron. Then this was a bunch of really extraordinarily bright people. Oh, Frederick Aston, who was on the right wall, right in the front there, he was another Nobel laureate, won a Nobel Prize for Chemistry in 1922. So we've got an extraordinarily bright group of people here working on aircraft development. So one of the people I'm going to talk about, and I would like to say thank you. I've got a research student, Tony Royal, who is actually working in great detail on mathematics, and particularly the kind of relationship between engineering and mathematics in this period, and particularly as it relates to aeronautics. And he actually was a former pilot himself, so he's very knows rather more about some of the dangers than I do. So some of this more detailed work, I'm very grateful to Tony for having provided me with information. Now, David Hume Pinsent, another extremely bright mathematician, ends up at the Royal Aircraft Factory by sort of accident. One of the things I also should say is that most of these people that I'm going to be talking about end up doing their mathematics for the war effort by accident and not by design, from the point of view that mathematicians were not mobilized, not in the way that physicists and chemists and things were. And as the war progressed, of course, people began to realize and understand how much more this war was a scientific war compared to anything that had gone before. I mean, think of things like poison gas and so on. But the mathematicians were sort of nobody sort of saw them really as a group to be kind of put into places where they could really do useful work. And so a bunch of them do end up, as you'll see, in doing extremely important work, but by their own determination, really, rather than that of the powers that be. So Pinsent was a good friend of Wittgenstein's, and Wittgenstein, in fact, dedicated his Tractatus to Pinsent and was devastated when Pinsent was killed in a flying accident. And Pinsent wasn't allowed to enter the army because he was very small and he was rather frail, which is why he sort of ends up at the Royal Aircraft Factory. And while he's there, he works on slipstream velocities, that's what's going on behind the wings, and on tail loading, because they needed to understand how the weights on the tail from the point of view of the stability of the aeroplane. And there's a quote I have here from Thompson. I mean, he talks about Pinsent as being the most brilliant man of my year, amongst the most brilliant I've ever met. Now, Thompson was no slouch, so Pinsent was somebody really special. And we're very fortunate we've got some photographs, and this is a photograph of Pinsent with Farron in de Havilland 1, and actually if we sort of zoom in on it, we can see Pinsent in the front cockpit with instruments, and in fact people really loved flying with Pinsent because he was so small, they could put more instruments in the cockpit with him. So he was a very popular pilot. And you can see there, I mean, the instruments are about as big as he is. So the sorts of things he did, it's a bit difficult to see from this picture, but this is a static tail load test, and you can see this is where they've got the load on the tail of the plane, and they're just loading it to see how much weight it can take. And this one here, you can see this is an aeroplane that's actually upside down, and they're testing the wing. And you can see all the stuff that's fallen off the wing. They've been loading the wing just to see how much it could take, because you need to understand how much pressure a wing can take, both from underneath and from on top. One of the things my student Tony has found, he's been in touch with the Pinsent family, and they very kindly have shared their Pinsent's correspondence with his mother with him. And there's this rather poignant letter where he writes in January 1917, "Please don't worry about me. Of course there's always a certain risk flying, but it's infinitesimal compared with what it would be if I were in the army. And when you think of the numerous people, like Thompson, that's G.P. Thompson, who've been observing for almost 2 years without a single accident, it must really be very small. The only risk really nowadays is something breaking whilst in the air." And then, sadly, Pinsent dies the following year. And they were carrying out pressure tests on a plane similar to this one. This was a de Havilland 4, and the tailplane failed. It broke in the air, and he was killed. So Frederick Lindemann, who I've mentioned, Pinsent mentions Lindemann. Lindemann is on the back of the motorbike. Apparently, he never went anywhere without his bowler hat and umbrella, even when he was flying. He would go to the plane with the bowler hat and umbrella and hand them to someone before he got into the plane. And he says, the other day, the great Lindemann discovered when up in the air piloting an aeroplane that his airspeed indicator was marked in knots and not in miles per hour. He hadn't the least notion how much a knot was, but he knew it was 1/60th of a degree longitude at the equator, and he knew the radius of the Earth in centimetres, and he proceeded to work it out in his head whilst in the air. This was quite, obviously, quite a feat of calculation, but it was sort of pales into insignificance when you learn that one of the other things that Lindemann did at this time, he was very interested in the problem of spinning. And this was a really serious problem. They were losing a lot of planes because they were going into a spin, and the pilots didn't know how to get out of a spin. In 1 month, in 1918, apparently something like out of 106 crashes, 41 of them or something were due to spins. So trying to understand why an aeroplane spins and what you need to do to get out of a spin was really an absolutely vital problem. And so Lindemann had been observing planes in spins, and he had worked out a theory about how to get out of a spin. And so at some point he decides he's going to go and test his theory. Well, this is kind of a brave thing to do, really. So he goes into the plane and goes into a spin, and sure enough, his theory works. But while he's in the spin, he keeps in his head 8 parameters, because he needs this information to feed back when he's on the ground. And of course, when you're in a spin in a plane, you can't really start writing things down. So he kept in his head, he noted from the instruments and things, which again, the instruments I can't imagine would have been terribly stable anyway, the height of the entry of the spin, the height of the recovery from the spin, the airspeed, the number of turns he went into, the angle of the airflow either side of the wing, the yaw, that's when the way the plane's going like this, and the elapsed time. And he was doing these experiments with Hermann Glauert. And Glauert, who has been described as a mathematician with unusual powers of verbal exposition, he really wrote his mathematics very beautifully, and was a very popular member of the staff at the Royal Aircraft Factory. So it was a kind of combination between Lindemann up in the air, getting all the numbers, and then Hermann Glauert down on the ground doing the mathematics. Another person who was at the Royal Aircraft Factory was Barry Gates, and I've included him because he's a sort of example. He wrote himself about how he ended up there. He finishes at Cambridge. He's a Cambridge Wrangler, 1914, and he immediately signs up to go into the army when war breaks out. And then this is how he describes it. He says, after looking at my puttees and certain other aspects of my military bearing under training, the army came to the correct decision about me. This man is no good for us. Let him go do the sums he's said to be good at. And Gates goes on, actually has a very distinguished career in aeronautics after the war as well. And he works with Glauert on stability problems. And this was, as well as spinning, the stability of the plane, this was another really crucial aspect. And there was a mathematician I'm going to say a bit more about called Brian, who'd written a book on stability and published in 1911, and had really got the whole process going, but to do. And so there are a lot of them working on the whole question of stability and the control of an aeroplane. And this is where Gates did some really important work. And I liked this kind of quote about him where it says, his lifelong quest was to carve a way through the inevitably harsh and complex mathematics of aeroplane motion to the shelter of some elegantly simple design criterion. So, as well as the Royal Aircraft Factory, there was the National Physical Laboratory at Teddington. And so where at Farnborough, they were designing planes, putting planes in the air, at the National Physical Laboratory, they were doing experiments in wind tunnels. Now, the laboratory had been founded in 1900. It was modelled on the sort of German version of the sort of equivalent in Berlin. And they decided that it was sort of run by the Royal Society at this time. And it was decided that in 1909 they should have a Department of Aerodynamics, and that this needed to be overseen by a committee. So the Advisory Committee for Aeronautics was formed at the end of April 1909, with Lord Rayleigh as president, another Nobel laureate. Greenhill, who I mentioned at the very beginning, was on the committee. Lanchester, who is an important figure in this story of the development of flight, and he certainly plays a part in the war, but I'm not going to be saying anything more about him, purely because I can't talk about everybody. Horace Darwin, we'll meet again, but Horace Darwin was the Cambridge Scientific Instruments Company, and he was the son of one of the sons of George Darwin. So we have a bunch of really significant people in this Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and they were concerned about the possibility of invasion by air, and particularly things went into slight overdrive after Blériot crossed the Channel in 1909. So they'd formed this committee, and then a few months later, Blériot makes it across the Channel. And of course, we hadn't had invasion from foreign power since the Dutch had come up the Thames in the 17th century. So, so this was one of the things that was sort of behind the thinking. And as I've said, wind tunnels, what they were doing there was that they were simulating the effects of they had models, and they had model planes and so on, and wings and so on, and they were doing the experiments in these wind tunnels. The people there, again, Leonard Bairstow is the sort of leading figure. He was a very influential mathematician, aerodynamicist, and he led the aerodynamics department through till 1917. And the rest of the people here, all Cambridge Wranglers, strong mathematical backgrounds, so we've got, basically, we've got the two, maybe let's just go back to that. We've got the two places where the work is being done, both at Farnborough and at the National Physical Laboratory. And what I should have mentioned here was there was quite a controversy between the two, because they found that the results they were getting at the MPL didn't match the results they were getting at Farnborough. And they initially thought it was a problem to do with scale. And in fact, it turned out that they just hadn't allowed for the effects of the walls of the wind tunnels and the turbulence. And that caused quite a lot of difficulty between the two. Now, the Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, also, they were, as well as being sort of overseeing what was going on at the MPL, they worked as a committee looking also at what was going on at Farnborough, and they worked as a connection between the universities and industry as well. So they had a sort of oversight about what was going on. So you've sort of got quite a mesh of things going on. So these are the people who are getting the planes in the air. So now we're going to look at the people who are shooting them down. As well as planes, of course, I mean, the big sort of fear in the war were the Zeppelins. And this is a letter from one of Carl Pearson's assistants in his laboratory at University College. And she wrote to him saying, "The whole of London is in a state of subdued excitement today as a result of the raid last night. We're all congratulating ourselves that we've seen a Zeppelin at last. A bomb fell in the centre of Queen Square. I was coming home in a tram just before 11 o'clock when the driver called out that there'd been a Zepp that had been fired at twice. Then the tram stopped and the lights went out, whereupon several women began to shriek. I got out, walked home to find all the neighbours in the street gazing heavenward. Nobody obeyed the instructions to seek shelter. We could see the flashes of the anti-aircraft guns, but they all went very wide of the mark. Now, of course, actually, I mean, see, the Zeppelin seemed to be like quite a big target, but it wasn't so surprising that the guns weren't hitting the targets, because up until the First World War, ballistics had been concerned with flat fire. And so actually, shooting up into the air at a moving object was a whole new science. And this is what we're going to see now. And the people with the guns needed range tables. And there were range tables for flat fire ballistics, but they weren't anti-aircraft range tables. And this is, this is a letter from Carey, who was Professor of Mathematics in Liverpool, to Sir Joseph Larmor, who was the Lucasian Professor in Cambridge. And he writes to Larmor, and he says, a gunner's written to ask me to solve a problem, the problem of sighting an anti-aircraft gun. And he says, as far as he can tell, it's quite a difficult problem, but he's got some mathematicians who might be able to solve it, but he can see that it's of really first-rate importance in view of the reconnaissance being done by aeroplanes at the front. And then he says, I hope you'll be able to press this important matter on the government and get a satisfactory set of tables for our keen-to-learn gunners. After all, we can't expect them to solve differential equations at the front. So there's a pressing need for these range tables. And so in 1916, the anti-aircraft experimental section is formed. And it comes down through the Ministry of Munitions, whose responsibilities included the development of air defences. And within the Ministry of Munitions, there was the Munitions Inventions Department, who had one of the principal functions was to investigate and experiment upon means for dealing with aircraft attack. And the two people who were really the founders, or who had the foresight to see what was needed, were Horace Darwin, who was on the Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, and Sir Alexander Kennedy, an electrical engineer. And they set about getting together a group of people. And the first thing they did was they thought, well, they needed to get somebody to run this outfit. And they very sensibly hit upon A.V. Hill. Now, Hill had been, he was a physiologist, but he had done the mathematical tripos in, I think, about 1907, been a high wrangler, but he was a fantastic leader of men. He was incredibly diplomatic. He clearly engendered confidence in those around him. He got people to do things from it. It was a really inspired choice. And so what Hill has to do is he has to collect mathematicians to work for him. So the first thing he does is he goes off to see his old tutor at Cambridge, G.H. Hardy, and to ask him to come and join his section. And Hill recalls later, he says, when he's invited him to join, he says, Hardy replied at once with indignation that he was not going to prostitute his brains on such a job. He was a pacifist, he protested, and was ready, if called to, serve in the army, but to prostitute his brains, no. But Hardy didn't mind prostituting other people's brains, because he gave Hill the names of two other very promising mathematicians, R.H. Fowler, who was recovering, he'd been wounded at Gallipoli, and E.A. Milne, who was a second-year undergraduate, both very talented mathematicians, and who joined Hill's group. And a third person who joins is H.W. Richmond, who was a geometry don at Cambridge. And it was with Hill at the top and with Fowler, Milne, and Richmond, this was the sort of mathematical mainstay of what colloquially became known amongst them as Hill's brigands. And they were based after, they didn't initially go there, but they ended up being based at HMS Excellent down in Portsmouth, which is where they were doing the experiment. So they were firing the guns, taking the data, and working out the theory. And this was also being done in connection with people, some of the people at the MPL. Bairstow wasn't involved in this particular bit of work, but Gallup and Locke, both Cambridge men, were. And then there was a very strong tie-in with Pearson's, the biometric laboratory at UCL. So what was happening was that the mathematicians were down at HMS Excellent. They were doing the experiments, they were developing the theory, they were gathering the data, and then they needed all of that to be translated into range tables for the gunners. And that's where the biometric laboratory came in. So Carl Pearson, I'll say a bit more about him in a minute. I should say what the functions of the AAS are. So that what they were detailed to do, and it was all kind of laid out, that they were part of their job was to construct range tables and graphic range tables and investigate gun trials of fuse burning, effects of temperature, pressure and spin, and theoretical analysis of results. There are also ordinary gunnery problems to look at, and also they looked at the investigations of problems connected with locating aircraft by sound. But the sort of mathematicians, so these more physicists were involved more in these other, the second and the third bit, so I'm going to concentrate on the first bit. So what was the problem that they had to solve? Well, as I say, the difference was between firing up at a moving target and firing flat at an essentially stationary one. And if you're firing at a stationary target, then you just have to, you've got one thing that's important, the point of fall. You want to hit that target, but it's still. So you just know what the distance is and how you're going to angle your gun to fire it so it lands on your target. But when you're firing up in the air, you need to know every point of the trajectory. You've got two chances of hitting. You can hit it on the way up, you can hit it on the way down. But you've got to have the fuse. When you're hitting your shells up, the fuse time is important because you need to know when the fuse is going to go off, so it's going to go off as it's hitting the target. And it's a very complicated problem because apart from anything else, you're working in 3 dimensions. You've got things like the wind can affect it. You've got varying air density. You've got the speed of the aircraft, the angle of the aircraft, how much it maneuvers, the height. You've got visibility. We don't have radar in the First World War, so it's a complicated problem. And so they break this problem down. It's broken down into sort of into a primary problem and a secondary problem. So you calculate the trajectory on the basis of certain assumptions and approximations. So, for example, you think about still air. But then you have to have correct for secondary problems, things like the curvature of the Earth and the rotation of the Earth. So it really is a complicated problem. And one of the issues, as we'll see, is that the people in the AAS had quite a job to convince the military that it was a difficult problem to solve. And so where they were doing this computation was, as I said, was at Pearson's, the biometric laboratory in University College, and they were producing these range tables, and there was a huge amount of calculation was required. So Pearson had a bunch of 9 calculating machines that were wearing away. He had a bunch of people working for him. They were mostly either undergraduates, postgraduates. Women were also involved. You can see this was the list of his staff in July 1917. And Pearson was one of the people who was very supportive of having women working with him, both not just only during the war, but even before the war and after the war. And he published papers with women as co-authors, and this was very unusual at this time. Pearson gets brought in January 1917 to the AAS, but he had been, as soon as war had been declared, he immediately offered his services to help with the war effort, and so he'd been involved in other things. He'd done sort of unemployment charts for the government, serial tonnage charts. He'd worked on torsion to do with propellers for the Royal Aircraft Factory and so on. And one of the important things that he recognized was that he could be much more efficient and it would be much more effective if he had his bunch of assistants working together, that they worked together as a team, and that you could actually, and he drew out charts of how you could get the work done in the most efficient way. And this was something, when you see the correspondence, we're very fortunate, there's a very rich Pearson archive. And you can see he's all the time, he's telling the people in the ministry or whatever that it's important to keep his staff together so that they can work more efficiently. And of course, I think there's another thing slightly behind it. He wants also to have them all together for after the war as well. Also connected with Pearson and with the AAS are the people doing ballistics at Woolwich, and one of the people there is J.E. Littlewood. And some of you may well know, of course, Littlewood's name. Littlewood was one of the leading British mathematicians of the first half of the 20th century, and he collaborated with Hardy, and probably one of the great mathematical collaborations of all time. He signs up, he goes to the Royal Garrison Artillery, and does important work on devising a particular method for the calculation of high-angled trajectories. Later on, after the war, Hardy rather sort of pithily says, well, even Littlewood could not make ballistics respectable, and if he could not, who can? And this was in the context of Hardy being somebody who felt that he, with pride, felt that none of the mathematics he did was of any practical use at all. In fact, it turns out he was very wrong about that, because he did work in number theory, which has been very important and influential in sort of cybersecurity and things. But there was a sort of a tension between them, I think, at this time. Of course, their collaboration, which had only really just begun at the beginning of the war, their mathematical collaboration went on hold, really, during the war. But Littlewood was certainly made an important contribution. I mentioned calculating machines, and I found this was quite an interesting little anecdote, really. Pearson puts an advert in Nature, the journal Nature, because he's running out, his calculating machines are wearing out. And of course, not of course, but a number of them, most of them, were German. So he wasn't going to be able to get them replaced or mended. So he puts this advert in Nature and says, look, if you've got a calculating machine you can let me have, please could I use it for the duration of the war, and I'll give it back to you afterwards. And it really won't have lost any value at all, and you'll be doing something for the war effort, effectively. And Arthur Schuster, who had been Professor of Physics in Manchester, but was now retired, was fervently patriotic. He had German parentage, and he was very, very kind of conscious of that. And so he, if you see about his career in the war, he's working hard for the Royal Society and doing things. So it's sort of quite natural for him. So he says he's read the letter, and he's got this millionaire calculating machine. And then he says the difficulty to get it to London is it's a bit heavy, £72 for a calculating machine. I think you'd be rather surprised if you saw what people had for calculating machines today. But it was a serious problem. So here's part of a graphic range table, and this is just a small corner of it. The table itself is more like this, and I have actually got, if anybody's interested afterwards, I'm happy to show you. This comes from a book, a textbook of anti-aircraft gunnery that was published after the war. And this, the book details the theory behind the making of these tables. It has a number of these tables in it. But what you can see here, it gives curves of constant quadrant elevation, constant fuse, constant time. You can read off, depending on what information you have, you can find out other information. But the thing was that you needed to have a lot of these tables, because you needed to have them for a different table for each gun. You needed to have them for different fuses. So they needed to produce a lot of them. But Things didn't go all smoothly for the AAS. Hill writes to Pearson on several occasions saying that they are having a bit of problems. And he says, with reference to your queries of the Bosch flying above 21,000 feet, only freak machines have been to heights of 24 and 25,000. And there's absolutely no reliable evidence that his machines are flying at these heights. Various incompetent people have turned long-base height finders on the whole enemy squadron and probably got the opposite ends of the base on different targets. That is the explanation of these so-called heights of 24,000. They might equally, and probably do, get negative heights by the same means. The Bosch is not really a whit cleverer or more energetic than we are once we rouse ourselves from our peacetime lethargy. And then a bit later he says, our work is largely educational, not merely scientific. Otherwise, we should get on 5 times as fast. The ignorant people at the head of things who continually fail to appreciate the urgency and the point of a new idea and the new instruments are a far worse difficulty than nature. Nature is easy to investigate, being merely inanimate and reluctant, but to persuade military officers of high standing to unlearn their prejudices and to give one, especially if one is a junior officer, the credit for knowing one's job is infinitely harder and requires tact and patience beyond understanding. It has taken a long time to persuade them to adopt height instead of range, and the urgency of it has made one perfectly sick sometimes of the whole show. So the point here is that the military were basically saying, look, can't you just use the range tables you have and push them through 90 degrees, you know, because you're firing up instead of this way. So, you know, they had a job on their hands, and Hill had a job on his hands from the point of view of, as the war progressed, I'm sure you all know, conscription came in, and there really was a real pressure on getting as many people to sign up as possible. So the recruiting sergeants would come and knock on the door, and it was for Hill was a past master at keeping them at bay by being able to persuade them of actually the importance of the work that was being done. Ian Milne, he was really probably the youngest of the group here, and he had a correspondence with his younger brother. His younger brother was still at school, so he was writing to his brother and telling him about his experiences in the AES. And he occasionally went up in a plane, and he would describe being in a plane and looping the loop. And I'm sitting in the library, and I'm kind of reading these letters, and it's really quite amazing. And of course, one has to keep reminding oneself how novel flight was at the time. So actually to write a letter to your brother and describe what it was like to actually be in a plane was really something worth writing about. He writes, the English officer is neither a mathematician nor a scientist, has an instinctive dislike for any method which will improve his shooting only on the case of being scientific, and prefers to trust to luck. Bit by bit, we are taking control of the course of action away from the officer and putting it on instruments which work automatically. The responsibility then remaining on the officer is to keep his men thoroughly trained and to keep his instruments in adjustment. The latter he will wriggle out of if he possibly can. So they obviously have rather a dim view of the officers. But they did have success. Hill goes to visit the British Expeditionary Force in France, and he writes back to Pearson. And he says, I think you and your people would be really gratified if you could be out here for a few hours and see how your diagrams are regarded. I've seen several of the Army Group commanders and the officers at GHQ. They affirm without hesitation that these diagrams are invaluable and fulfill a long-felt want, that they are beautifully done and printed, and that people here are really grateful for these charts, and that they spend a long time looking at them and so on, and they want to have a lot more of them. And then I think this is also, it's very sort of telling, he says, please tell your people of this. So Hill wants Pearson to tell the human computers who are doing the calculators that actually the work they're doing is really being appreciated. And this is typical of Hill. He really is thinking of everybody who is working for him. And here we have, this is the textbook of anti-aircraft gunnery from which that range table came. And when I first heard about the existence of this book in the obituary of H.W. Richmond, who's the editor. So I thought, oh, this will be just the thing I need for my research. So I trot off to the British Library to get it, only to find it's not there, or in the Bodleian, or in the UL at Cambridge, until, of course, the penny drops. It was classified. So it's not in the copyright libraries. But Abe Books comes to the rescue, and I found a copy of it in a bookshop in Winnipeg. Was very delighted to have it, and as I say, I'm very happy to show it to you, but it was a fantastic resource for me in this research. I mean, apart from anything else, it lists all these people who were involved in the book, and it details how they went about developing the theory, and actually the book was still, it was 2 volumes, it was used in the Second War as well. But it was really a huge undertaking. A few other people who weren't actually attached to the, any of the institutions I want to just mention, particularly G.H. Bryan. He was Professor of Mathematics in Bangor. He'd been a Cambridge Wrangler. He was a bit of a singular character, it has to be said. But his book, Stability in Aviation, was really important work on which all kind of theories of stability of aviation were kind of started from here and grew out of this book. But the thing about Bryan was that he was one of the few people who was canvassing all the time for mathematics within the development of aeronautics. And as a quote from him, he regarded every aeroplane as a collection of unsolved mathematical problems. He worked with Brodetsky on a grant from the Scientific and Industrial Research, and that was, again, that was sort of new, putting money into this kind of research coming from the government, and he prepares reports for the Advisory Committee for Aeronautics. But 1 or 2 quotes will just give you an example of him. So he gives the Wilbur Wright Memorial Lecture in 1915. And one of the people who reports on this says, "We've all heard lately the insistent cry, 'wanted more shells.' That's the response to the artillery shell crisis of 1915. Those who would read his book, Stability in Aviation, and in fact everything he's published on the subject as far back as 1897, would find that throughout his work the insistent cry was to be found, 'Wanted more algebra.'" And then he often writes columns in Nature and various places, and here he writes, "When stability in aviation was in the press, fatalities occurred daily, and killing off the pilots of unsafe machines was the only method that the practical man would have anything to do with. To evoke the assistance of a mathematician would have been an idea too terrible for words, and as for compensating him for his loss of time over this work, this might have cost 100, which would have been a preposterous waste of money when the same thing could be done by smashing up 10 machines costing £1,000 each." So, you know, he's really highlighting this kind of tension between the mathematicians and the pilots here. And we find this, and these are just 2 of many quotes. But he does very valuable work. And one of the people he works with, Brodetsky being senior wrangler, and he was a lecturer in applied mathematics in Bristol, and he collaborates with Bryan. And Bryan puts an advertisement, again in Nature, looking for students to collaborate with him. He gets this money from the newly established, as I say, Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, and Brodetsky works with him. And they work in Bristol. Bristol is where there is an aircraft factory there, where the Bristol planes are being made. And later on, in 1921, Brodetsky publishes a book on mechanical principles of the aeroplane. Glauert doesn't give it the best review, saying it would have been a good book 6 years ago. Bryan immediately on the defense, Brodetsky's his boy. You know, this is Brodetsky is performing for aviation what Clerk Maxwell accomplished in anticipation of modern electrical engineering. I think a little bit overblown on Bryan's part. But it's an interesting example of collaboration in the war that the war brings about. Women come into this story as well, a number of them, and again, my student Tony Royal has actually just had a paper accepted on the women who are working on war problems in the war. One of the most important was Hilda Hudson. She comes from a real mathematical family. Her father was Professor of Mathematics at King's College London. Her mother had studied maths at Newnham. Her elder brother had been Senior Wrangler. Her elder sister had also studied at Cambridge and had been equivalent to the 8th Wrangler. So she has a real mathematical pedigree. She goes, after studying at Cambridge, goes to Berlin. And she ends up at the Admiralty Air Department doing important work there. And she, after the war, gets an OBE for her work and publishes papers. And we can see, I hope you can just see here. So these, if you look at the bottom, she does a paper on the strength of laterally loaded struts. The blue ones, these are the struts, and you need to understand the loading on these struts. And then the incident wires and the incident wires are the two wires that cross these struts. The other wires on the plane are the landing wires and the flight wires. And there's a group of women who are involved in doing various things. Code breaking. Code breaking is something that you might imagine is done by mathematicians in the war. Not at all. This extract says, I should like to emphasize in this connection the importance of selecting the right kind of brain to do this research, i.e. code breaking. For research of this kind requires an active, well-trained and scholarly mind, not mathematical, but classical. And during the war, the code breaking was done somewhere called Room 40, headed up by Sir Alfred Ewing. And he did have one mathematician in the group, someone who'd been Professor of Applied Mechanics at Greenwich, but in fact he was more interested in having him there for his ability with German. And so that he was really keen to employ linguists. And of course, code making and code breaking was very different. They were using code books, not codes such as this kind of codes that were used in the Second War with Turing and so on. So it was just a completely different problem. And to kind of stress that, William Burnside, who was Professor of Maths at Greenwich and actually is very well known in the mathematical community, he's the person who really brings group theory to life in Britain. And he writes to Larmor to say that he'd been in touch with Ewing to offer his services, basically, for the war effort, and Ewing had ignored him. And as he says, one recognizes in such times, present mere mathematics are pretty useless, I'm not much good with my hands, but there should be some way of doing something. And in fact, there isn't the kind of, I don't know exactly what happened, but because we don't have Larmor's response, but shortly afterwards, Ewing gets in touch with Burnside, and he sets him to work on the problem of screw propulsion. So he goes into applied mathematics, where he's been doing pure mathematics. He'd actually had a lot of applied mathematics before he started on his work in group theory. But clearly Ewing did not see that Burnside was somebody who would have been useful in the code-breaking scenario. So my final, sorry, I realise I'm getting very close to time. My final little section is about the mathematicians who didn't contribute to the war effort for reasons of conscience. And this was quite a surprise to me. I found that there were more of them than I would have expected, and kind of probably proportionately in the population, more of them. And how I found out about them was through the diary of a Cambridge undergraduate, F.P. White, who was a conscientious objector. And his diary, he has a fantastically detailed diary, which is preserved at St. John's College, Cambridge, from the beginning of 1915 to the middle of 1916, when he ends up in the Friends Ambulance Service. But he's right in the thick of the sort of peace movements in the various organizations, and we learn from his diary he goes to Bertrand Russell's, and the story of Bertrand Russell is well known. Of course, he's imprisoned for his anti-war sentiments and so on. And there's a big to-do at Trinity College, at Russell's College, and there was a memorial sent to the Council of Trinity because Trinity wanted to expel Russell for forever and a day. And these were the fellows who said no, they did not want Russell to be deprived of his lectureship. From here that the ones in red are the people who contributed to war-related research, and the ones in blue are the ones who were in some way connected with either being conscientious objectors. So it was kind of evenly split. And what you see when you look at the people who were really promoting Russell, depriving Russell of his lectureship, it was the kind of older fellows of the college, and these are the younger fellows of the college. But if you're interested in this particular story, Hardy in 1940, can't remember, somewhere around about then, actually wrote a very detailed account of the whole Russell affair, and it really gives in a lot of information and it's been reprinted. It's a really interesting episode. But this is another story about Hardy that comes from White's diary, and White reports in his diary that Hardy's published a tract, which indeed he had, with Marcel Ries, who was a Hungarian, and he'd been writing letters to him, and one of Hardy's letters had been stopped by the censor because it had got mathematics in, and they thought it must be a code message, and that because there was a German name in it, they felt that it was must be something that shouldn't be allowed to get through the censorship. So that's sort of another dimension. And Hardy and Ries, on the sort of front page of this book, they put this Latin phrase, the author's enemies and friends, at the same time. Max Newman, very important figure in the Second World War, in the code-breaking story. And he writes to his chum, Harold Jeffreys, saying he's become a conscientious objector, more or less, and he's seeking exemption from military service, but not from work of national importance. So you could say you would be prepared to say go and do something, but you just didn't want to go to the front. And in fact, he had German. His father was German, and he changed his name by deed poll during the war from Neumann to Newman. Two other figures, Ebenezer Cunningham. Cunningham was had been so horrified at the effects of the Boer War. He was a Quaker and a pacifist. He wrote the first book to be published in England on relativity, and the war really broke him in a way. He did really quite important work on relativity and things before the war, but after the war he did very little. Eddington, Plumian Professor of Astronomy, very well known because of the Eclipse expedition after the war to test Einstein's theory of relativity. He was a Quaker. The university asked for exemption for him on grounds of national importance. They needed the observatory to keep running. Eddington at the tribunal said he wanted it also to go down, that he wanted to be exempt on grounds of conscience. But the university didn't want that. They wanted him to be, so that they don't get him exemption for that, even though that's actually what he wanted. But he does get exemption for a limited period, and luckily for him, the period was longer than the war. And then we have White himself, who I mentioned, who was the kind of source for a lot of this material. Through the diary, you see, he comes up in front of 5 tribunals before eventually he gets work with the Friends ambulance service. And I mean, at one point he thinks he's going to go to prison. He's even worried about, he's told his friends that he's got books that need to go back to the library, and will they take them back, and so on. And there's a bunch of mathematics students. And what's interesting is that in the diary you see how there's such a difference between the intellectual atmosphere in Cambridge and the atmosphere for him at home in London. His parents really, they want him to give up his pacifist sympathies because it's so frowned on, and they're fearful for him going to prison, but he won't. I mean, it's a matter of conscience for him. And of course, there are the losses. We were lucky in Britain, really. The mathematicians didn't suffer anything like they did in France. In France, they lost the whole of a sort of generation from the École Normale, École Polytechnique, went to the front. But one of the most poignant, I think, is Wakeford, who was killed on the Western Front in 1916. And a mathematics paper was found in his kit bag. And it was published by the London Mathematical Society quite a long time after the war, but it in the publication, it just says the manuscript ends here. There's no explanation, because, of course, everybody would have known and understood. And Wakeford was the first person to have his obituary published by the LMS who wasn't actually a member of the LMS. And it ends with the sort of haunting words, he only needed a chance, but he never got it. And he was clearly one of the most talented of his generation. Finally, this is a quote from E.B. Wilson, who was a professor at MIT, and he was saying how important the English mathematics was for the development of aeronautics. And he was actually running courses at MIT for the military in aeronautics. So he's making the point here that actually Cambridge mathematics is this grounding, that practically all these people that I've mentioned had their grounding in Cambridge and had done the mathematics tripos. So what was the effect of the war? Well, we have people like Hardy moves from Cambridge to Oxford, partly due to the treatment of Bertrand Russell. That's not the only reason, but that's part of the reason. We get chairs of aeronautical engineering and aviation. The role of women gets changed dramatically during the war, obviously not just mathematicians, but in general. We get people's careers changed completely. Milne and Fowler, two people who were absolutely set on careers in pure mathematics, go into applied mathematics. Glowis and Gates, who were at Cambridge, both stay at the Royal Aircraft Establishment, make careers in aeronautics. Neville was one of the people who supported Bertrand Russell and was well-known pacifist. It was felt that he didn't get his job renewed at Cambridge because of that. Douglas Hartree, I haven't mentioned before, but he was an important figure in computation. Barnes, another supporter of Russell, he left mathematics for the church. And Cunningham, I mentioned, ceased research. And of course, we have the losses. And finally, this was a funny diagram. So it's a pastiche of Egyptian hieroglyphics. I don't know if you can see it, but it's finding the center of gravity of a Tarrant table. This was this enormous triplane that had a very short life, actually. It didn't. It crashed on its first flight, but you can see it in the middle there. And in fact, there are people from the Royal Aircraft Factory who are actually noted on the diagram. It was drawn by somebody at the Royal Aircraft Factory during the war, so we can see Glowis and Gates and Southwell there. And you see the plane in the middle with its 6 engines and so on. And that's the end. Sorry, I run over time.
Thank you, June. So, we have some time for questions. There should, I think, be a roving microphone, and it would be appreciated if you waited till the microphone got to you for the purposes of the recording. Okay, who has any questions? No? Yes, right at the back there. Wait for the microphone so we can all hear you. Yep.
I'd just like to ask you, as someone who's a non-mathematician, if the gentleman E.A. Milne was related to A.A. Milne, the author.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay, thank you. It's just one of those things I'd like to find out. Thank you very much.
And also at the back there.
Thank you. I'm curious to know, not having gone to a London or Oxford University, what was going on in the other universities, and in particular in the northern ones in Scotland, and what contribution did they make to the war effort?
Well, of course, this was a period when there weren't many universities, actually. I mean, there were colleges and so on. So at the beginning of the war, we had the London universities, Oxford and Cambridge, the Scottish universities, the Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds. There were people there. Quite a number of the people who were professors in those universities have been Cambridge trained. So this was a period when it was sort of the beginning of, as I say, those sorts of universities. So some of the people had come, there were people who had been working in some of the other universities who ended up doing various things. But it was so different to how it is today, in as much as the universities then, you'd have had one professor and one assistant or something, somewhere like Liverpool or whatever. So you would not have had the staff. Where the big concentrations of mathematicians were in Cambridge, London. Oxford had a number of mathematicians, but it didn't have I mean, if you wanted to study maths at that time, then Cambridge was where you wanted to be. The other place where actually a number of these people were educated, which I should have mentioned really, was Imperial College. So people like Bairstow and Lanchester and things had studied there. And Imperial College only came into existence in about 1909 or something. It was a kind of amalgamation of a bunch of colleges, the Royal College of Science and Central Technical College and things. So that was a sort of technical thing. And there was always a feeling, I mean, like Lanchester always, I think, felt, because he wasn't a Cambridge man, he felt he was a bit of an outsider. There was a certain tension there, I think. Does that answer?
I think you mentioned Professor Wedderburn from Edinburgh was
yeah. Oh, yes. He was in the anti-aircraft gunnery book. Yes.
Okay. Question back here.
Do you have any kind of comparative evidence about the contribution of these mathematicians versus, say, people who were in the military developing aircraft and developing machines? So what was their relative contribution compared to other people in the field?
Well, I think that they were the people who were doing the theoretical work. So when you look and you see what actual developments there were made, how they developed the planes to be bigger and more stable and so on, there's a bunch of reports that get produced by the committees. And you see these reports are all being written by the people either at the MPL or at Farnborough. So I think that there was, as I've mentioned, this real sort of tension between some of the military in terms of not really understanding what was required. And it tended to be, dare I say it would seem that the army were more guilty of this than the navy. They got a more sympathetic hearing from the naval officers. But I think if you were in the military at that time, I would guess that you felt that your job was actually being a soldier. And there were people who felt, I mean, like Wakeford, who was killed. I mean, someone who had something really to offer in a scientific sense, but felt that his place was at the front. And Fowler, actually, I think it was just sheer luck, really, that he ended up, because he was wounded at Gallipoli. He ends up at, and then has a very, very significant career after the war, actually.
Okay, this gentleman here. Third row, thank you.
Yep. Very interesting talk. One of the most striking things about this period is that there was no evidence of mathematical modelling, decision-making under uncertainty, what, of course, we know as operational research that developed during the Second World War. The emphasis in the period you talk about is on applied mathematics, engineering, ballistics. Very good work was done there, but I wonder why the other aspect, modelling, decision-making, didn't come to the fore during that period, and was it in fact, was the omission a lost opportunity?
Well, possibly. I mean, Hill, actually, I think is somebody who's quite important in the sort of development of operational research later on. I mean, because he gets pulled back in again for the second war. And sometimes when you see, people will write about the things that were were being done with the AAES, and there was a sort of almost the sort of embryonic element of operations research in the way that they carried out their work and what they did. But I don't know, really. I think, and one of the things I do think does come over very strongly, really, is how slow we were in actually recognizing the significance of science in general. And that's, you see that, that is written about quite a lot. And
it might have been Blackett who said during the Second World War, I think we're paying too much attention to building the machines and not paying enough attention to how we use them.
Yeah, so maybe that was sort of, yeah. Because, yes, I think at the beginning of the war, I mean, we were considered to be really quite behind with certain things. So, yeah, so I can see that the pendulum would swing the other way.
So my question is, how much is this part of science in general in the war? I mean, I guess there must be physicists and chemists studying explosives and so on. Is this, I mean,
this is a partial picture. I mean, I've just been interested in seeing, I was interested to see what mathematicians done. I was, my curiosity was piqued really because of knowing what mathematicians did in the Second War. But of course, at places like, both at the MPL and at Farnborough, I mean, there's a bunch of people doing, physicists and chemists and working on all sorts of things, obviously materials and,
exactly,
and structures and I mean, there's a lot of physics and chemistry and things going on. I mean, so this was very much I just wanted to try and see if I could understand what mathematicians were doing. And I think the thing that was striking was the fact that they weren't mobilized in the way that the people didn't see how mathematicians could help. So it's sort of, they kind of came in through the back door to a certain extent.
And did it generally improve the standing of science in the UK?
And I think, you see that newly they formed the Department of Scientific and Industrial Research, and I think, things definitely changed from the point of view of, as I say, that, in academic terms, the sorts of things that were being taught and the chairs, those chairs of aeronautics and so forth. I think people recognized then that we needed to get more up to speed and to have mechanisms whereby people could be brought up to speed.
Thanks, June. Very, very nice talk. In response to the question about the operation research, I think the point is that was all part of general ideas about systems thinking and, in the end, socio-technological systems, which came about in a later period, and the OR was part of all that was coming together at that point. But my question is, I was very intrigued to find your reference to the cryptography and the need to get some good old classicists rather than mathematicians, which of course reminds us of the whole of Bletchley Park. Is that the first time, do you know, that people have said, actually, these are the people that we want to help us break codes? It's not necessarily the mathematics, it's the logical thinking.
Yeah. I don't know, I mean, I was very struck by that remark too. I haven't researched into sort of code breaking and things, but I did expect to see some mathematicians being brought in, that people would think that was the logical thinking of code breaking. And one of the things that struck me also was that what was clear was that you can see that they realize that they're breaking codes, and they don't sort of see the kind of relationship between sort of breaking codes and making codes. It's sort of where the mathematician would think about inverses, and the little bit I've read is that you can see that isn't going on. They don't see that the fact that they're breaking the German codes, then, so but it is, and I mean the linguists were the ones that they really wanted.
Front row, please. Yeah.
The basis of your talk was mostly centered around World War I, and you mentioned that you did a bit of research on World War II. How much exactly of the research, of the work done by mathematicians in World War I carried on to producing more work during World War II? For example, you mentioned range tables and volumes.
Yes, so I mean, this particular book that I mentioned was used in World War II, and certainly a number of the mathematicians, the young mathematicians who were involved in things in the First War, went on and did work in the Second War. But so someone like Max Newman, who didn't, he actually was a sort of effectively a conscientious objector, not a strong one, but when was very important in the code breaking in the Second War. So I think that there was a recognition. I mean, the difference was that they could see that there was a use for mathematicians in the Second War, which they hadn't recognised in the First War, and I think that's the big change, it seems to me. Whereas I think the Germans, on the other hand, had recognised that, and that's one of the things that Greenhill's saying. Look, they think that people should know that mathematics is important in all its spheres.
Gentleman in blue.
Hello. I was just wondering whether any useful understanding came from German pilots who might have been, might have been asked to help, or somehow or another, gave assistance, having been captured.
That's not something I haven't heard. I haven't come across any reference to that at all. I mean, certainly you do see. I think when German planes crashed, they certainly picked over the bones of them to find out what was, as much as they could. And there was also, with a lot of the work that was being done, it was classified too. The work the mathematicians were doing, as well as that textbook, but various things. So there was definitely a lot of secrecy about particularly the development of air power. But I haven't come across any examples of German pilots. Well, and of course, I don't know to what extent the pilots would actually have had the technical knowledge anyway. They probably would not. I mean, their job was to fly the plane, I would imagine. So.
Right, thanks.
Any further questions? Yes. Back here.
This is a formidable effort of organization of science, of research. I wonder what happened when the war ended. Was it transferred to science research councils or any other form of organization?
Sorry?
Yeah, the effort that was put into the development of all these exercises, when the war ended, was it transferred to science research councils or?
Well, I mean, certainly what happened with a number of the people involved in the anti-aircraft experimental section, like Fowler and Milne and things, they carried on doing research on particularly things like the dynamics of spinning shell and things. So, and papers were published in things like the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society. So they did carry on with some of that research after the war. Milne and Fowler and Richmond, a bunch of them carry on doing things. And of course, a number of people like Glauert, who stayed at the Royal Aircraft Factory. And so before the war, I don't think they had really thought of having mathematicians, somewhere like the Royal Aircraft Factory, which was then the Royal Aircraft Establishment, I don't think they had really thought of having sort of resident mathematicians before. And so I think that is what happens. And also some of the collaborations that happen with Berry, who was a mathematician from Cambridge, who collaborates with people at the Royal Aircraft Factory. I mean, he continues that after the war and things. So I think those some of those connections and networks certainly continue.
Okay, I think we have one last question from third row back.
Thank you. I happen to live in Kingston, which has got a rich heritage in aircraft construction dating back to 1908 or 1909, something like that. And it only finished in my lifetime maybe 20 or so years ago. And thousands, if not tens of thousands, of planes were constructed there. Now, to what extent were Sopwith and his team just getting it right through skill or intuition or whatever? And to what extent did they need or rely on input from the mathematicians you talk about?
Yeah, so there was as I've said, it was really a misnomer that it was called the Royal Aircraft Factory. So they were definitely, there was this connection between them and getting the theory out to within industry. But I think within, and there are certainly examples of some of the mathematicians, ending up in industry, working for different manufacturers. I mean, there were quite a lot of these small manufacturers around. I was quite surprised when I looked to see, all these planes that were being made and the different names that they had and the different people, the different companies that were building them. So, so I think that there was, I mean, I haven't looked at all, I have to say, at industry to look and see the people who were working within industry, what sort of mathematical engineering training they had. But sort of no one's risen to the surface in that respect, if you like. But that's not to say there are, they aren't there. But there was certainly the Royal Aircraft. I mean, they needed the planes. They needed someone to make the planes. So they were definitely, that information was going out to industry.
Okay, well, thank you very much, June, for a really stimulating talk. Very, very interesting indeed. Thank you.